Cool. Recording is started. It's official. Okay, folks. Thanks for coming out to this on this really nice day. We're going to be talking about CEQA. You saw the email. I can just give you a little of what our thought process was and how it's designed. Is people are always asking about CEQA and are always confused about CEQA and the process of CEQA and how to use it, when you need to use it, and all these things. And a few times we've gotten people who are experts to come and give a presentation. Sometimes they just show you the CEQA flow chart, and you kind of sometimes leave a little like, how do I use this for prescribed fire? So we kind of wanted to get a few people together who are actually working on projects and who are also CEQA experts to kind of be on a panel. Also with the understanding that a lot of people in this group, it's a very targeted group, also have a lot of CEQA experience potentially. So we're going to go really heavy with the question answer session and go with like the first, I think 10 or 15 minutes. We're going to talk about what CEQA is, when it's triggered. And I think Jason Wells is going to do that. And then Marc Andre is going to talk about lead agency and kind of the flow chart, just to kind of set people up with the foundation. But then we're going to quickly try to move into kind of a more conversational piece and answer people's specific questions. So that's pretty much it. I don't know if there's much more to say than that. I would like to introduce everybody. I'm just kind of everyone introduce themselves on the panel. My name is Brian Peterson, fire ecologist. I work for Fire Forward and various other places throughout the state. And my background's in botany and vegetation ecology. And I've done a fair bit of CEQA work as a biologist, but not as a planner. So that's kind of where stuff gets muddy for me. So I guess I'll kick it over to Marc. You want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, good afternoon. Nice to see some familiar names on this Zoom. I'm Marc Andre, a registered professional forester, currently work with BBW and Associates in Arcata. Was a former City of Arcata Environmental Services Director for years, and had a lot of CEQA exposure on a variety of projects in that realm, not just forestry, trail projects, water, wastewater, utilities, and things. And I was on the Board of Forestry for about 10 years, so CEQA was near and dear to my heart in trying to work on forest practice rules, exemptions, legislative solutions, statutory exemptions, and things like that. So still involved in helping projects get permitted and environmentally compliant, and mostly in the forestry, and more lately in prescribed fire and fuel treatment realm, and working on forest health grants, quite a few of those too, through CAL FIRE.
Great, thanks, Marc. Lyndsey, do you want to go next?
Sure, I'm Lyndsey Lascheck. I work for the Shasta Valley RCD out of Yreka and Siskiyou County. I help support the Siskiyou Prescribed Burn Association up here. And I still reject the title of being a CEQA expert, even though people seem to think I am, but I'm very much still learning, and have just learned everything through kind of having to figure it out through doing in my last 2 years here at the RCD. And most of what I have learned is from Marc and others. So, thank you, Marc, for being here today and lending all of your great knowledge and wisdom to us. And yeah, I'm just kind of here to help support, because we've, we're moving, we're doing CEQA for some prescribed fire projects and other, fuels and forestry projects in Siskiyou County through a couple of different avenues, through CEs and the Cal VTP. So, I'm just sort of learning through those processes. So kind of happy to share my experience with that through this conversation. And yeah, thanks everyone for being here today. It's great to see such a great turnout.
it's great to see how many people are suffering with CEQA fear. Okay, Jason, do you want to go next? Thanks, Lyndsey.
Sure. I'm Jason Wells. I'm also a registered professional forester, and I'm the forester and work on forestry program stuff for Sonoma Resource Conservation District. So we do a lot of like categorical exemption type stuff with CEQA. My big project experience was actually more in timber harvest, which is it's a functional equivalent process of the environmental impact report. I agree with Lyndsey. I wouldn't really call myself like an expert on CEQA, but I know what it is and know how it affects me working for a public agency. So yeah, hopefully we can help get everybody on board, and it shouldn't be too complicated. So
great. Thanks, Jason. Delphine, do you want to go introduce yourself?
Sure. Hi, everyone. My name is Delphine Griffith. I work with Lyndsey at the Shasta Valley RCD, and I'm here to take notes and compile resources so we can send them all to you after this workshop. So yeah, reach out to me if you have any specific questions about resources that you might have missed or anything.
Great, thanks. Yeah, and just want to say a big thanks to people who are kind of being here on the panel today, because it's the end of the day and they're giving their time. So really appreciate that. And I think we can probably just jump in and get started. Like I said, just to say it again, we're gonna go about 10 or 15 minutes talking about some of the basics, and then we're probably gonna go more into question answers. So start writing your questions down while Jason and Mark are kind of going through some stuff, and we should have a pretty good time. Okay, Jason, do you want to start?
sure thing. Okay, so the thing I wanted to start off with here was sort of the big picture. What is CEQA, and what triggers CEQA, and why is everyone so afraid of CEQA? And so first off, I mean, what CEQA is really at its root, it's a public disclosure process. So anytime a government agency enters into a project, they have to disclose that there won't essentially be an impact to the environment. So a project is any activity that may cause either a direct physical change in the environment or a reasonably foreseeable indirect physical change in the environment, in which is any of the following, which now it just went away from me, but essentially it's any time that public funds are spent, anytime a public agency actually conducts the work themselves, or anytime that a public agency issues a permit in which they have discretion over the aspects, the individual metrics, I guess, of that permit. So if they can say, you know, that we would like you to change this particular aspect about this to mitigate the impact that you're going to have on the environment, that would be discretionary, versus a ministerial permit is one where it's basically like you check the boxes and you pay the fee and you get the permit. So a ministerial permit does not trigger CEQA. It's a routine sort of maintenance kind of thing. And so, I mean, that really is what triggers CEQA. And I think that the thing that people get caught up on a lot, especially from the PBA aspect or from the public aspect, someone who's trying to put together a project where they don't work for the government, is that when you're receiving grant funds, that granting agency would be required to go through the CEQA process. And so one of the things about being a public agency is that it doesn't necessarily have to be public agency staff who put together the CEQA document. Oftentimes when we do CEQA required projects, if it was something that was more than just a basic, yeah, this is exempt and we can file and move on that way. And Mark's going to talk more about what that flow chart sort of thing means. But if we had to do like an initial study to determine whether or not we had to do a mitigated negative declaration or an environmental impact report, we probably would hire that out to a consulting firm, and they would do the work of coming up with the study and coming up with whether or not that was going to have an impact. And then our board, because the RCD has a board of directors, would essentially review that material and approve it. And so it's the approval of the public agency for the public disclosure process, basically stating, here's all the things that we think that our project could impact the environment or have a reasonable impact. And here's what we're going to do about it, or how we're going to avoid. And I mean, that's on a real like high level, that's kind of all CEQA is. It gets caught up in a lot of things, I think, because people sort of confuse the identification side and the disclosure side with being the things that are causing the trouble. But frankly, the thing that actually gets you are all the other laws out there that your CEQA process is supposed to be identifying and mitigating. So CEQA isn't what's making it so that you can't, take threatened species. That's the, whether or not it's the California Environmental Quality Act or Endangered Species Act or the Federal Endangered Species Act, right? Like same thing goes with like archaeological resources, ends up being a big thing that we spend a lot of time with. It's because there's other processes that would hold you to that. CEQA is just saying that you crossed your T's and dotted your I's. So that's something I think that people get confused with a lot. And for our purposes, from a PBA purpose, one thing that's really important to know is that burn permits are a ministerial document. So if you're doing work privately, funded with private dollars, and you're not accepting government assistance, the only permit really that you'd be looking at getting is going to be like smoke management and a burn permit. And both of those are ministerial documents. So they do not trigger the whole process of identifying whether or not this activity is going to have a negative impact on the environment. It doesn't start the CEQA process. So that's something to keep in mind. You don't need to go through CEQA for every single project that we ever did. It's only really when you're going to include government partners. So either in the implementation, so if you were using CAL FIRE for their vegetation management program, you'd be having to go through that process. Or if you were receiving funding from the government, you'd have to go through that process. And that's it. Or if you work for a government agency. So if you work for the RCD and you are doing that work, you would have to go through the whole process.
Okay, great, Jason. Is that pretty much all you had?
I think that's all I was supposed to talk about. And
Sweet. Yeah, I think that hit about the time we were hoping. So if it's okay, I'll pass it on to Mark to talk about lead agency. And cool. Thanks, Jason.
Before we transition, I'm just going to mention one thing also that, CEQA is for any ground disturbing activities. So you can do planning and, educational workshops and all that kind of work without necessarily doing CEQA. It's once you are putting in a fire line or, lighting a fire or anything like that, like that's where your CEQA has to be done. But a lot of the preparatory work or even just training work doesn't necessarily have CEQA. So I just wanted to put that out there.
Yeah. Okay, I'll go next. Good job, Jason. Yeah, there's a lot to CEQA. I'm sure many of you, I recognize names who I know have plenty of exposure to the CEQA process. I think that, by the way, Delphine has a bunch of documents that we've put onto a Google Drive that you can access later to look at some of my favorite resources that could come in handy for this group pertaining to prescribed fire and other similar fuel treatment projects. I just want to touch on, some of the aspects of CEQA that maybe hang people up sometimes, and some lessons learned from my point of view. But first I want to just, follow on in terms of what the CEQA flowchart could put you to sleep for sure, but it's important to understand, CEQA applies to projects that are discretionary, that by government agencies that could affect the environment or have a significant or any environmental effect. And the lead agency, is the public agency, whether it's a water district, RCD, state agency, city, county, open space district that has the primary responsibility for carrying out the project or approving the project. It could be either of those things. So the lead agency, it's important to try to get that figured out ahead of time, rather than fish around for one, although that can work sometimes. You don't always know, but they're the ones that make the decision, and they're the ones that end up posting the environmental documents on the state clearinghouse and with the county clerk at some point. And whatever they are, if they're negative declarations, EIRs, mitigated negative declarations, or some sort of a categorical exemption. So identifying the lead agency is important. For an NGO, oftentimes, say it's a restoration project, Water Board can serve as the lead agency for or CAL FIRE many times for an NGO, a nonprofit. So you want to make sure your project description is as crisp as you can before you identify your lead agency. There's also the responsible agency under CEQA, is a public agency that has some discretion or authority over a project or even a portion of the project, but they're not designated as the lead. So that could be CDFW or some other state agency who could influence the project. And I just also want to stress scoping and pre-consultation with those other agencies up front. It's really important. So at some point I'm interested in knowing what issues people are having, so I can kind of get at the question part. And I want to also say I'm happy to follow up with anybody individually after this short workshop we're having, if there's something specific that you want to discuss. In terms of the process, okay, I know a lot of people, and I'm going to go to exemptions, categorical exemptions that people think may be suitable for prescribed fire. But I'm going to get back to, don't be afraid of a negative declaration or a mitigated neg dec or an EIR. Really, the purpose of CEQA is to inform the public, decision makers, about potential significant effects. If you don't have any, that's great, but you don't really know until you go through the process. And if there's some environmental damage you can identify that you can avoid by changing your project, that's great. Or a mitigation measure, that's not always so great. But in terms of going to talk about exemptions because minor alterations of the land, people use that often. And really, you have to build your, to make your findings for an exemption, you have to do your environmental work. And you could just store that, or have it on file at your agency or at your office, because you don't want to get caught filing an exemption without having the documentation that you went through, a thorough review, whether it's for, biological aspects or potential water quality impacts or archaeological effects. You really got to have sufficient evidence and a record to support if you get challenged. I think it's like 0.03% of all environmental documents in California have a court challenge. So it's pretty low odds, but you don't want to be the one that has a challenge and you don't really have the documentation that you've done your analysis. So in terms of the lead agency, if they hire a consultant to do their environmental documentation, they can delegate to that consultant or third party to actually post those notices as well. I should mention that with the state clearinghouse. So anyway, lead agency, responsible agency, then you have your trustee agencies, which are like also not CAL FIRE, but CDFW and the Water Board primarily. And so they all get notified. And that's the important thing up front. If you don't pre-consult or scope, they're going to get notified of your project intention, and they can comment on it. Once it gets circulated, they get a copy. So lead agencies can't be non-government organizations, but for CAL FIRE grants, for example, or forest health or fire prevention grants, CAL FIRE doesn't want to necessarily be the lead agency, but they will, if you are a recipient of one of those grants, and you have no other options. Sometimes a county can do that, or an RCD, but I know these days CAL FIRE is looking for to not be that one all the time, because just the volume of projects that are going on right now. They can do it, and they will do it. And there's a whole approach that's a little bit different there in terms of what they might want. But really, getting back to exemptions, which many projects that you do might fit them. Not a statutory exemption necessarily. There aren't many that would be applicable for this group, but categorical exemptions. It's a limited analysis, and the whole idea there is your project is going to contain sideboards to it where the significant environmental effect is not going to happen. You're going to avoid wetlands, you're going to avoid water courses, going to minimize noise, dust, and you're going to probably not do broadcast burning with an exemption, unless piles probably okay, unless you do some extra analysis to build the case for that and have BMPs. We're trying to work with the Shasta Valley RCD to develop a template and a suite of BMPs that are similar to the vegetation treatment program, programmatic EIR, protection measures, standard protection measures that can be a suite of operational things that we're not calling mitigation measures in this case. So anyway, I just want to stress that as you go through your analysis, really, you don't know until you look at your sensitivity in your project area, what the factors might be that might lead to more in-depth type analysis. So an initial study is just the best way to go, in my opinion. That'll direct where you take it from there. And if you go an exemption route, that's great. Just document everything. If you go to a negative declaration, that's fine too. It has a different noticing procedure. But if you go EIR, which I've done quite a few times, it makes you sleep better at night. It seems that you've gone to that degree and you've covered all the bases, and it's not necessarily always more expensive to do it. So I just want to say there's no reason to do an environmental impact report unless you have really either your agency needs to make some overriding considerations that, oh, there's a significant impact, but these other things are more important, or that you really have to, go through and create mitigation measures and a mitigation monitoring plan that you can rely on, so no significant environmental effect can occur. So in terms of decisions on a project, some agencies allow, want their boards. Oh, and this is something I wanted to stress because I think it might be pertinent. If you're doing an exemption, you want to make sure your administrator record is clean and clear the date your project's approved, either by the delegated CEQA person in your agency or your board on the date they approve a project. And otherwise, don't file your notice of exemption prematurely because it can be void and it could lead you to a 6-month process. And if you think you've messed up, file another one because that's only a 35-day process. So this is just another thing. I've seen somebody do one that was not appropriate. It was premature. They filed it before their board made their decision date to approve the project. And they had a 6-month process because they didn't correct that and file a fresh one. So anyway, I just wanted to point out a couple things because those have been common in some smaller projects. What else do I want to cover? I think that's it for now. Mostly in terms of legislation, it's changing all the time. The state of the art of how CEQA is approached it's changing as well. The CEQA handbook, I think, is free. You can get one from the state clearinghouse. And if you're working on a project, a lot of your projects probably are similar. I would recommend going to CEQA.net and querying that now and then for similar projects, whether it's prescribed fire, fuel treatment, and you kind of get a flavor of some projects that are out there who've gone through the process and see how others have treated things. Not to say that it's always the best, that it was the best way to go, but I think it just helps, especially with projects that have a lot of responsible agency input, just to see how they structured their analysis. Another lesson learned type thing.
Hey Mark, could you explain to people where the Cal VTP kind of lives in this process and just kind of how that relates to this whole flow?
Okay, I should touch. Yeah, thanks for reminding me.
If that's it's a good time to do it.
Okay. Well, the Board of Forestry and the state approved a programmatic environmental impact report that applies statewide for fuel treatment work, separate from the other vegetation treatment program. But and what you can do, the beauty of a programmatic approach is all your analysis has been done mostly, but you have to tier off of that and create your own specific project analysis. It streamlines things, you know, and as people get better at it and have more experience with it, it'll you know, the time frames for doing these will speed up, you know, like anything, there's a learning curve. So anyway, the programmatic approach was designed to be an approved EIR that you can rely on to do prescribed fire, to do field treatment, to do whatever, mastication, to do a whole variety of things. But it doesn't get you off the hook from doing some specific analysis. And the two main things are typically, you know, archaeological surveys. It's really hard to get around that. If you know where your arc sites are, that's great. You just protect and flag and avoid. And then sensitive habitats, whether it's botanical or listed species that you need to hone in on. But those are the prime. I mean, there's more. There's much more for sure. But anyway, using that tool is one way to go. It's not the only way to go, but it's a helpful way to go, especially for the larger size project. Thing about programmatic EIRs, they don't expire. You know, you can always amend your EIR later, but the programmatic approach is really a good way to go. And somebody could create their own EIR for like a watershed or a county similar to that, but there's no point now since that PT EIR was created. Really, the state could do more with the programmatic approach for other things, and I think that we'll see more of that in the future.
Cool, Mark. Thanks. Do you think it's a good time to move on to kind of questions and answers, or did you have more you wanted to go through on that?
Oh, I just wanted to mention, you know, if you look at the Board of Forestry's monthly binder, there's a legislative update that shows, you know, new legislation or pending legislation, and there's a lot in there. There's always about 5 or 6 new bills pertaining to forest health and prescribed fire, and so if you want to track some of those, there's been some tries for more statutory exemptions for prescribed fire that haven't quite panned out, but there's always a lot of action, and it's going to evolve, you know, just because of the scale of what needs to happen on the landscape. Needs to be enabled, you know, in a couple ways, maybe by some other legislative solutions, and then, but mostly by people like yourselves who are out there developing the projects, and hopefully not having a bottleneck with the permitting and CEQA aspects too much in the future. Trying to figure out ways to appropriately, you know, get projects to the point where you can actually implement them.
Great, yeah. Also, I think it was said before, but there, Delphine did put a Google Drive in the chat that has a lot of really great documents that kind of Mark had sent us earlier, and they're really helpful. You can get that flow chart and a few other things, and it's pretty helpful to look at those things. So use that resource.
I just want to chime in real quick on like, why would I use the programmatic EIR that the state developed as opposed to doing an exemption process? I think one of the biggest things is the scope and size of the project. So you don't have that many categorical exemptions, right? The one that Mark brought up that gets used often for this kind of work is called a minor alteration to land. And so what that says is that you won't impact mature, healthy trees unless it's specifically for agricultural or forestry projects. That's not defined necessarily. Like when does that come into play? Every agency gets to deal with this differently. I think that's the most confusing thing about CEQA, is that the actual determination is left to the agency. So there isn't a nice, clean 14-inch trees is the size, you know, like that comes out of that comes down to the agency who's reviewing these sorts of things. And another big question is, what's minor? You know, so like, I think that most people looking at a ground crew only small vegetation clearing project that's 5 acres, 10 acres, I think you could make a pretty easy argument that's a minor alteration of land. What happens when you get to 100 acres? Or what happens when you want to have a project, you know, using some of these grant dollars that is, you know, is 100 acres of mastication with 300 acres of broadcast fire thrown on top of it? I think you're getting real far from what you could say with a straight face is a minor alteration. And so that's where having this already done EIR process, right? So the state has already looked at a whole suite of environmental consequences that could come up from each one of these project specific analyses. And they've already come out with sort of prescribed actions to do. So either you're going to avoid it, or you're going to mitigate it in this way, or you're going to, you know, maybe you can't mitigate it, but you will offset your impact. So can't avoid this critical habitat at all. And this project is still important and we have to do it. So we are going to save critical habitat somewhere else near our project area or something like that. I believe that's one of the many options. So you, the public agency, looks at that EIR, you look at your program, your project, and when you're doing your project specific analysis, you basically get to choose from the suite of options that they've chosen and go with it. So that's going to cover 90% of, you know, if you needed to be doing a project analysis for a big project. But sometimes you still might not. Maybe there's some weird thing that, you know, nobody would have thought about at the state level that does apply to your project. And, or maybe you just really need to do it this way. You're going to have to go through your own EIR process, and that could take 8 months and like $80,000. So that's why it's a helpful resource to have that available, so you don't always have to go to an EIR. Hopefully that made sense.
Yeah, and that's what is designed to make things work better. And that one too requires, you know, pre-consultation, and you don't have to invent your own mitigation measures. They're already there. You can customize them for your location and your particular situation. But yeah, for most projects, that's the way to go. Although, you know, we've done a couple of mitigated neg decks in the Mattole watershed, and Redwoods to the Sea is one of them, and that was a fairly painless process. No comments. And I think that was a combination with BLM too. So there probably a lot of you working on those types of projects that have some federal and private acres that are combined. So,
and I guess before we unleash this to questions, I do have one further thought that Mark kind of drew from me here, and it's when he was talking about CAL FIRE not specifically wanting to be the lead agency on every possible project that comes their way, because they're going to get, you know, dozens of huge grants thrown at them every grant round, and then, you know, eventually it just gets to be a huge administrative burden. Like, that is where finding a partner, a local partner that is a local government agency with charge over your project is really helpful. And so, you know, working for an RCD, that sort of is a great fit. especially seeing how we operate majorly like off of grants. If you can approach your local RCD with a potential project and have some minor scoping and understand what your actual project is going to be, and then you go to them and get their endorsement and then work with them as who would become that lead agency for that project. You could, when you're applying for a grant, you could basically say lead agency is going to be Sonoma RCD, and they will be the ones making the determination for CEQA's purposes, and that's going to put you higher up on the ranking for when CAL FIRE is trying to determine where to get money to. So,
And I just quickly want to add, if you do end up engaging with like a local entity like an RCD or county or someone to be your lead agency, and you're applying for a grant, make sure you write in funding for them to do that CEQA, because I know like for our RCD, we're 100% grant funded. So, we have to have it tied to a project to be able to even do it.
yeah, do it early. Also, communication early. Don't like write a project, have a plan, have a budget, and then say, oh yeah, by the way, would you mind being the lead agency? Because that actually doesn't even meet the definition of what a lead agency is supposed to do. They actually have to be the closest to the project. So whether or not that's design and implementation and oversight, the RCD would have to be involved in your project for them to be that. They can't just be some tag on sort of thing. Otherwise, the funder with millions of dollars going to the project would arguably have the most interest in the project. And so they would be the lead agency.
Okay, great. Do people want to start? Do people have any questions? They want to jump into that portion. Perhaps we can try people just piping in. You can also raise your hand and I can kind of facilitate that as well. But Brooke, did you have a question?
Yeah, I had a quick question. Yeah, it was what's the lifespan of a notice of exemption or mitigated neg deck? When do you have to go back and complete another notice of exemption, say something for like a shaded fuel break, where you're going to go back in, you're going to establish it, and then you're going to go back and maintain it maybe in 5-8 years, that NOE?
Does anyone have insight to that?
Yeah, that's a good question. If there's a change condition, that would likely require, amending that or filing a new notice if conditions have changed. There's no like date certain that, it expires in 5 years or anything like that.
Great.
Okay, did anyone else have a question?
Yeah, this is Kirk Ford from the Tuolumne RCD, and I do have a question. Okay. Are we talking here? Can you
Yeah.
hear me? Okay.
Yeah.
Back to what Jason was just talking about. And this is for Jason or Lyndsey or Butte County RCD or Steve, I see you're on also. If the RCD coordinates the planning and gets the burn permit from CAL FIRE and smoke management permit from the air board, but the RCD is not the implementer of the burn. The PBA is the implementer of the burn. So do your RCDs actually implement the project itself and take on the liability, or is it the local PBA that's taking on the liability of the project? And also, what do you do that implementation work?
Well, I can say that the RCD for Sonoma RCD, we have not done anything hard fire. We haven't done any broadcast work yet. And I would expect that if we were to do something like that, given liability and insurance requirements, we would probably be working with CAL FIRE through, and so we'd be looking at doing a VTP and then maybe permitting, and then trying to get CAL FIRE crews in there specifically. And I probably would not for a large grant. But that's me, and like we're still figuring this out. But I probably wouldn't have it be a PBA thing. The other thing is like not every PBA is set up in the same way. And like I know that our local prescribed burn association, when we have burns, that's the landowner's responsibility. And it's not really like our PBA is leading the burn. So, and these are questions that we're always having, because at what point do you need insurance? And at what point, you know, like you can work with a private burn boss and you can work with private crews. But I think it also depends also on the specific agency and their comfortability with that setup. So Lyndsey could have a totally different.
Yeah, I can just share how we've done it, because we have implemented some small demonstration burns with state funding. And the way we did it was the landowners led the burn, you know, so, and we had an agreement with the landowner with, you know, mutual indemnification that, you know, the landowner as the, you know, one implementing the burn on their property had the liability. But we had, you know, the RCD had funds that helped pay for some resources to assist. We also, you know, helped write the burn plan. So in terms of liability, that was kind of the biggest liability that we took on was, you know, like my name was on the burn plan, but our board of directors was comfortable with that. And so in that case, that's the way we have done it. I don't know, Wolfie, you guys, I think have been doing a lot more burning than us, so you might even have a different perspective or way you go at it. So I'd be actually interested if you're willing to share.
Sure. The Butte PBA has assisted at 10 landowner burns, no, 11. And from our perspective, the RCD is not implementing the burn. The PBA is not implementing the burn. The landowner is implementing the burn, and it is our honor to be there providing day of burn education, coaching, mentorship, technical assistance as the landowner implements that burn. So we do help with burn planning. The landowner is the one who is the final approval of the burn plan and signs it and stuff. We're happy to help with air quality permitting. And if we have the money, we'll even pay the air quality permit fee with the landowner's name on the permit. And that there's nothing about that triggers CEQA. Are our staff there helping out on burn day and making sure that volunteers are safe and they know where they're supposed to go and people are learning, and you know, maybe if people have task books open, they're getting their task books signed and teaching people how to take the weather and teaching people how to do this and that while the landowner is holding his or her burn. Sure. And we're totally comfortable with that. And we don't think that those educational or training activities trigger CEQA in any way.
So have you done any CEQA documentation for any of the projects, Lyndsey or Jason or Wolfie? Has the RCD taken on the responsibility of the lead agency?
We have taken on the responsibility of lead agency for numerous projects, and we're pretty experienced with CEQA, but the PBA burns are not the kind of project that requires that CEQA.
Okay.
We did a categorical exemption for the funding that we had because our funding agency required us to do that. But you know, similarly, like Wolfie mentioned, the landowner was the one who actually held the permits too. You know, the burn permit and the smoke management plan or burning permit was in the landowner's name and not the RCD's name.
How we do it.
Okay. Okay, so I'm going to try to move this on. Lyndsey Daly's had her hand up for a while. So Lyndsey, do you want to ask your question?
Yeah, thanks so much. I actually have a few questions. The first one is, does anyone have a sense for budgeting purposes? Like what this is probably a hard question to answer, but average cost per acre for CEQA. I know, again, it's probably a hard question, but any range that folks would feel comfortable throwing out, just when you're budgeting a project and haven't done it before, it's hard to know what we might be looking at.
I can, sorry, it's not my
Yeah,
workshop.
go for it.
Okay.
If you got
So-
an answer, Wolfie, please. by all
So
means.
we do, you know, if you're gonna write a notice of exemption, like for a small, for like a 5 acre or less, or, you know, sometimes we'll do them for bigger, but if you've got all the documentation you need for a notice of exemption, it costs maybe $250 at most. It's $50 for a filing fee. And then there's, you know, some project manager or forester time, just developing that 1-page document and signing off on it. You may need to be pulling together supporting documentation from, like, oftentimes there will have been previous surveys from some other thing like a timber harvest plan or something, and we can just like use that as our basis for why it's appropriate to file a notice of exemption. So that's the simplest scenario. And again, 5 acres isn't a magical number. It can be more than that if your lead agency board is willing to stand behind that decision. Then going up to a notice of a negative determination or a mitigated negative determination, the filing fee itself is on the order of $2,500. And those are almost always going to be supported by surveys. If those surveys haven't already been done for some other project, I don't know why they would be. We find that archaeological surveys run between $35 and $60 an acre. Botanical surveys, maybe more like maybe half that. You may be able to get away without wildlife surveys depending on your season of implementation. And then writing those documents definitely takes some time. You should probably budget a good 60 to 80 hours of an experienced person's time pulling them together. That I'm sure I left things out. Others?
I mean, it's the big like answer to any natural resources question of it depends.
Totally.
You know, it depends on the complexity, it depends on the scope. It depends on who, you know, who's doing the surveys. You know, when we have our contracted archaeologists go out and do surveys, I mean, it can be, you know, off the top of my head, I'm having a hard time kind of grasping a number, but we usually tend to budget, you know, like $5,000 to $15,000 for that. It's pretty extensive. Or it can be, you know, and again, it just depends on the size and the complexity. And yeah, I think the document preparation and you know, analysis and review is definitely costly. But yeah, it's just hard to put a real number on it. Mark, I mean, you're a consultant and kind of do this,
Yeah,
so to speak, for a living. You might have a more or different ballpark figures to add.
yeah, sorry to cop out by saying it depends, but it does. And really, if a piece of property has a record, you know, previous surveys, or some past activities and actions where you know where resources are, it makes it a lot easier. Or like an NRCS management plan, for example, or CFIT management plan or something like that. In those cases, you might be able to use the environmental checklist to do some of this work. But yeah, it, you know, really varies.
Lyndsey, if I could jump in here, I would
one thing
imagine,
I
Lyndsey-
just want to finish. CAL FIRE for the forest health projects, they want people to put robust CEQA line items in there, and then if they don't use it all, that's fine. You know, then that can go. They can do an adjustment. But I'm hearing that from them that they're encountering that frequently, that gets under budgeted in many grant applications. So. Sorry,
Mark, that was exactly where I was going to go with that, just being tying it to trying to get funding from CAL FIRE. Because I imagine, Lyndsey, you know, it's really hard to write a grant, even if it's a lot of money, to be like, yeah, how much do I put into CEQA?
Exactly.
Okay, 20,000, 80,000,
Yeah.
you know, so.
Cool. Well, thanks for that. That's helpful. Another question I have is, so we have CAL FIRE funding right now, fire prevention funding to help coordinate the Lake County Cal checks that we're working on. And I've heard different things from different people. We haven't talked to our contact at CAL FIRE. It's a sub-award, so we don't have a lot of direct communication with them, but some folks are saying because the funding is being used just for planning, it's not triggering CEQA, and then other folks are saying, oh no, absolutely, that will trigger CEQA. So I'm just curious for folks here, do you have a sense of yeah, what the best direction is, and when in the planning process CEQA would get triggered? Like, we're helping plan burns. We'll probably use some of that funding to support like our crew to go out and be on burns, but not as, you know, we're not actually leading the burns. So where do we cross that line? Does that make sense?
So,
Yeah.
so you're putting together a plan that will lead to actions that will have separate environmental analysis at some point? Is that what you're saying?
I guess the question is like, is there a need for CEQA if we're planning burns that will get implemented, but not directly with CAL FIRE funding? The funding is going for the planning of the burns and the coordinating of the events, but on the day of the burn, for example, the funding is not going towards leading a burn, or, you know, there might, yeah.
I can take a stab at this one, because this is actually the comment I was going to make. So the Central Coast PBA, we're entirely CAL FIRE funded right now, for better and worse, and via 2 fire prevention grants. And this last round of grant applications that we put in for, we got awarded funding for 10 burn plans for landowners. And it was very explicit that no CEQA would be attached to those burn plans. So at least from like CAL FIRE's granting, overlords or whatever, they seem to give the thumbs up for that. And I believe, Susie, that's something that maybe you touched on, because I think Davey heard it from you. But so far that's worked out really well for us. And then, people who are doing coordination work like myself were funded via those grants. And what we've really found is that the 2 things that trigger the CEQA are paying for the burn boss to be running a burn. So taking that liability away from the landowner, running the show, so on and so forth. And then any kind of stipend for a volunteer fire department who's coming for the day. So in the future, we plan on actually going away from those 2 particular things, because it's actually small amounts of money, obviously, the burn boss and the fire department stipend. It's a little bit silly to be able to give $500 to a volunteer fire department and pay, $10,000, $15,000 in CEQA fees to be able to do that. So that's just kind of my comment on that.
I would just throw this out there, Lyndsey. I heard you say that you were hoping to pay some people with that money to be on the burn. Again, I'm no expert, but I would imagine that would start getting in the sketchy category of what should not be funded or might trigger CEQA.
So we have a workforce development sub-award through that same fire prevention grant, separate from the check sub-award, and we send the crew out on all kinds of projects as crew members where they're not, leading projects, but they're getting trained. So, so far that's been fine. And it seems like, yeah, from that perspective of really just sending people out to get paid to get trained, that has not triggered anything on our end. Does that sound problematic still from that perspective?
That sounds clever to me, but I don't know if that would be a problem or not.
So how do you define the project? Because it's conducting burns on the landscape, right? So it's having a physical effect.
Except for we're not leading the burns. So we're just showing up and providing, some personnel to support a burn that's being led by, sources that are not being funded by CAL FIRE.
Okay.
Isn't that what you were talking about, Wolfie? Like that you all did that too, or like people from your agency?
Yeah, that sounds good to me. I mean, when our staff is
Okay,
out on a
great.
burn, we're coordinating, providing education, coordinating the volunteers, and the training activities that are taking place. So the landowner is going to do the burn one way or another, but with us there, it becomes more of a community training opportunity. And I'm totally comfortable with that.
Yeah, I think it gets a little bit sticky when we have other sources of funding, like foundation funding, that are paying me to be the burn lead boss. And then that's the same burn my staff is being paid for by CAL FIRE as workforce development. That starts to get a little bit much.
I mean,
sorry, I've got
that's
one.
loopholing.
Yeah. creative use of different funding sources. One super quick last question. In Lake County, we have a bit of a conundrum in that we have a defunct RCD that doesn't really function. And the county is really horrifically slow in being the lead agency on CEQA and has tied up a couple of CAL FIRE projects for over a year now. So we don't really have any local lead agencies for CEQA, which is super problematic. Does anyone have any insights on other resources? Like, is it ever a possibility to go out of county to another RCD, or any creative thoughts on who else we could look to?
I think that's a tricky one because most RCDs have a, defined boundary for their
Right.
governance, right? So it'd be hard to go outside that. I mean, like I brought up earlier, a water board or another agency can step in to be lead agency if it's appropriate, but I'm not sure they would on a burn as much as a mountain meadow restoration project or something like that. But that could have a burn component to it. So, you might, if there's a water quality benefit or a CDFW, perhaps, if there's a, benefit for flora, that you might be able to get one of those agencies to be the lead agency.
I don't think it would be out of the question to have a neighboring RCD potentially do it. I mean, especially if, like if you coordinate with your RCD and they just don't have capacity. I mean, admittedly, Shasta Valley RCD, we don't cover all of Siskiyou County. There's actually 2 other RCDs in Siskiyou County, but they're not as engaged with this kind of work. And so sometimes the lines get a little bit blurred, but it just kind of depends on your local politics, I guess.
Yeah. Cool. Thanks, everybody.
Okay, unless anyone has any more thoughts to give to Lyndsey on that, I was gonna move to Kyle Farmer. He's had his hand up for a bit.
Question answered, but I was asked specifically about the $500 for the VFD. Are they still paying that just kind of out of a different budget column? And is that just, that's all you have to do?
Kyle, you're a little bit rough as far as connection there. Did anyone pick up the whole of that?
I can try and recap from what I got. It was a little bit garbled, but it sounded like it was a question for Jared about the $500 stipend for VFDs and something about a different budget category. I'm not sure, Kyle, if you want to type it into the chat.
Kyle, are you trying to say that I owe you money? Is that what you're trying to say? Yeah, I'm not really sure on the question.
Can you hear me now? I just walked outside.
Yeah, it sounds a little better.
Yeah. I was asking for clarity about the VFD that did you just pay out of a different budget column and you just doing the same thing?
Yes, I mean, so it's kind of an assumption. So it's not really, and yeah, it's a different budget column, but we've laid out in these grants that we have, say maybe 5 burns where we're going to basically make the whole entire burn happen. So we call them quote unquote full burns. So we're paying for the coordination of the burn, the site visits, my time and assistant's time, a burn boss's time, a CEQA person's time, and then we have funding specifically for VFDs that come and help out. And it really seems like the only parts that trigger the CEQA and all of that is actually the burn boss, and maybe, we're not even 100% sure on this, but maybe the VFD being there doing the work they're doing. Because when we've, described doing all the other things without CEQA being involved, CAL FIRE doesn't bat an eye about it. So,
yeah, that wouldn't matter unless there's a discretionary funds. If it was a private project with private funding,
yeah.
you're exempt.
So for instance, I do tons of coordinating and tons of site visits, and we are hiring burn bosses or fire ecologists to do the burn plans. And all of that, when just isolated on its own, doesn't seem to make CAL FIRE think CEQA has to be a part of it. So we haven't budgeted any CEQA for those projects. And then the irony, of course, with the VFDs is none of them have actually taken the money because they have to fill out a W-2 form, so they get lazy and they don't want to.
Yeah, but I think to your point, Kyle, that there is a strategy, I think, that's been emerging amongst folks, whereas you try to get funding, like Jared being all, the Central Coast PBA being all funded by CAL FIRE right now. In the future, it'd probably be nice to have that money and some other foundation money that wasn't attached to CEQA. So then you could kick that money down to folks. Anyways. Any other?
2 thoughts, I guess. One is that there are certain things that are exempt from CEQA. And the reason why you would put through you would actually do the notice is because you have a 30-day period for that to be reviewed, at which point at the end of that, you're essentially indemnified from future action against you. But you don't actually, there is no actual requirement to submit that. The difference being, if it's exempt, you can do the activity, but then you have a 180-day period at which point someone may look, and that's like from the end of your activities that you could find yourself in trouble. So some of these like really minor things, like we didn't lead the burn, but we did have staff present. I think that, again, it all comes down to the agency themselves, because again, the purpose of this whole thing is public disclosure. And so it's disclosure of funds that are being used and really justifying whether or not government money should be used doing that, So like, if your part in this project is minor in scope, would that fall under a minor alteration of land? Class 4 gives examples. You're not limited to those examples. They just have to be within that general scope. Another question that I have, it's more like a statement, I guess, is depends like how big is this burn that we're talking about? If it's a 5 acres that we're burning and we're not killing, which I think that's a key aspect here. We're not removing or killing, healthy scenic overstory trees. Something like that, very minor in scope, might very well be a minor alteration of land. CAL FIRE was operating prescribed fire under minor alterations to land prior to VTP. They will not do that now because they have a another way of going about that. They also had a checklist, an environmental checklist that they were doing internally to make sure that they were, you know, they were keeping themselves honest, because you should be avoiding impacts to resources. But do you need to go through the entire CEQA process to avoid impacts to resources? No. And again, it comes down to the scope and scale. If we're talking about a project that's 300 acres, you should probably have a CEQA document. But if it's a 5-acre burn, you're helping a landowner. I mean, it's fitting within their pile burn. You know, like we're able to do like 3-acre burns on our pile burn stuff around here. So it's pretty minor. Like that in itself could be a minor activity that doesn't require an environmental impact report or a study, or, you know what I mean? So, but again, it always comes back to like, who's the lead agency? Who's the agency that's spending public funds? And the purpose of the document, CEQA, is to justify to the public when you're using funds that you are not having a negative environmental impact. What do you think about that?
I think the case can be made to use those exemptions for those small projects frequently. You know, it's a limited analysis. You don't have to, you know, especially if you have information from previous work, you know, you make your findings based on information. And, you know, an agency can use the common sense exemption for a project where they can just state out and out there's not going to be a significant environmental effect for whatever reason they can put together. I mean, that's one of the exemptions. But yeah, CAL FIRE used, you know, minor alterations to the land for years, and for small projects it's totally viable, especially if you've done your ARC records check, you've done your California Natural Diversity Database check, and you've done some level of analysis and pre-consult, you know, with some of the trustee agencies, because there may be something you don't know about. But yeah, and if your agency is comfortable with that, that don't shy away from those. That's the way to go for a 5-acre burn, unless it's a 5-acre burn with a spotted owl activity center in the middle of it.
Yeah, I mean, I have shown up on, you know, local burns and considered it for myself to be training and showing up, got a hand tool and participating. I did not do a CEQA analysis. I don't think that my one person is ridiculous, you know. Like, so again, I think that there's the common sense aspect of it also, the planning, the implementation, all the funding. 99.9% of the work is being done privately just because I popped in, didn't make this a Sonoma RCD project. So
Also,
especially if you use a flapper tool, there's no soil disturbance, right?
Yeah, flappers are exempt. You don't, that's part of the flow chart. Wolfie, did you
Jason,
have,
to be clear, you didn't actually do any work on those burns. We all saw it.
True. True. I do a lot of hand waving. Yeah.
disturb the
Taking
core.
weather, it does not trigger CEQA.
A lot of breathing.
Wolfie,
smoke.
did you have something to say?
Sure. Yeah, I wanted to thank Mark and Jason for what you just said. Thanks for bringing up common sense. And, you know, I think when it's fire, suddenly it's a big deal. But a lot of organizations do all kinds of things that have environmental effects without doing CEQA all the time. A lot of organizations have a chipper program where the landowner cuts a lot of brush and you send a chipper around to chip the brush. Would they have cut the brush if you weren't helping them and just left it there in a big pile? I don't know. Have you ever had a volunteer tree planting party? Have you ever given kids fistfuls of seeds? Have you ever not burned something you probably should have burned? That had environmental effects, and nobody did NEPA or CEQA on the last 100 years of fire suppression. So thanks for listening.
I think we should demand that. I've been thinking about that. Major alterations to the land, hundreds of years of fire suppression. Jared, did you have something to say?
Real quick, I did,
Oh, yeah.
because that just reminded me also, there was a question earlier about planning and how that sort of thing fits in. So I would say that planning in itself, even if it describes a later project, is not a CEQA activity. I've got a couple reasons for this. We'll take the context of a forest management plan. I very often write forest management plans for use in other programs, such as the NRCS EQIP program or for the CFIP program. But I talk very much about conceptually what should happen and what sorts of activities you would do. Granted, those plans also have the information that essentially, let's say if I went to CFIP, it would be CAL FIRE who took that plan on, who would look at the contents of the plan and would fit it into their programmatic EIR for the CFIP program. And then that would be their CEQA sort of analysis. Part two to this, we very often at the RCD, we do a lot of planning with engineering work, and we don't have funding for the engineering part. We're just hoping that we can get funding for the engineering part. But we'll make a plan for how you're supposed to do this thing, and then we go and solicit funding, and then once we have the funding, do the project, then we do the CEQA analysis. So it's sort of like there's two steps. So I do think that there's some precedent for helping with planning, not doing the implementation or taking charge of the implementation. There's a bit of a separation there.
Yeah, and I think that's definitely bared out in some of the grants people have been getting as well. Jared, did you have something to say, or did you already say it?
Yeah, it's actually a question, and it will probably out myself as somebody who knows nothing about the VTP. So the programmatic EIR aspect of it is clear to me. But I've heard, at least from one forester who will remain nameless right now, that they took a look at the process and they really felt like it was a huge hassle for them to go down that road. And maybe they just weren't used to the process yet because it's so new. But I'm curious if anyone on this call has actually messed around with the VTP and found it to kind of streamline things for them and be worth their while.
I've messed around with it. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, go.
No, you go ahead, Wolfie. Whatever you say is gonna be better than me.
Well, I don't know. I mean, we utilized the VTP EIR for a 3,000 acre cross boundary burn project on SPI and Forest Service land up here in Butte County called the Concow Pyrodiversity Project. And we considered writing an MND, and our local CAL FIRE unit kind of just really wanted to see the VTP EIR utilized in our county. And so partly out of curiosity, partly out of courtesy, partly, I don't know, just for the heck of it, we used the VTP EIR. I mean, it's not done yet. I think that if we'd gone an MND process and we'd, had the same level of staffing, or maybe just like literally 20 or 30 more hours of staffing time, I think we would have finished a MND before now. So a couple of things with the VTP EIR. I guess the biggest one that stands out for us is that it requires CAL FIRE to finish its burn plan for the burn before the notice of consistency with the VTP EIR can be finished. And we wouldn't necessarily do that with an MND. I've definitely seen plenty of MNDs where it just says, you know what, a qualified burn boss will write a burn plan before we do this burn. Box checked. I'm
confused, Wolfie. But what if? sorry, that's just not the case on the one I worked on. Was just getting funding for a project through the Coastal Conservancy. There was no, it wasn't like a Cal VTP. It wasn't like a VMP. So Cal Fire wasn't involved at all. So are you saying
Oh,
that's the case
okay.
that Cal Fire is going to be running the burns?
I think that may be the case, yeah. So for
Okay.
us, so what's going to happen is there's going to be a cross-boundary burn where CAL FIRE is actually the implementer on part of the burn. Forest Service is the implementer on the other part of the burn. Didn't occur to me that, well, sure, CAL FIRE wouldn't be writing the burn plan if it weren't. Right, so on your burn, on your project, Brian, did the Cal VTP EIR require whoever will be writing the burn plan to write it and submit it as part of that documentation?
No.
Oh, okay. All right.
No. But even if it did and it wasn't Cal, I mean, I don't know how to say this. I mean, once Cal Fire gets involved, you can add 10 years to your project. So I think
Well,
even if it wasn't writing, using the new state California template, I think would not be that big of a hump either. It's just coordination.
yeah, maybe our experience and delay were more associated with CAL FIRE taking a bigger leadership or lead agency like role in, are they the lead agency on that VTP EIR? Maybe they are. I don't even know if we're the lead agency or not.
Classic.
I normally would know
they
the
are.
answer to this question. I just, believe me, but yeah, so for them, I think it might be a case where that using that environmental document maybe hampers them more than it would hamper a partner utilizing it independently. So take what I'm saying with a grain of salt, everybody.
Well, I think that actually brings up a really good point, Wolfie, that in my experience, which is just writing this one and kind of diving into that, but no one really knows, including CAL FIRE, exactly how this is all going to land as far as process goes. I will say really quick, Jared, to kind of go back to your question. For me, I can say my personal experience was it took a while to understand what the heck was going on. And that took a little bit of effort, but it's important to remember that it's an EIR. It has all the CEQA stuff in it, like aesthetics, air quality, all this stuff that doesn't, well, air quality does, but all these things that don't actually really matter in the realm of burning or thinning and this kind of stuff. And once you figure out which boxes to check, saying, because they have all these mitigations, like crew members will not idle trucks all day long. That's how we're dealing with sound. So there's all these ways, which once you go through all that stuff, it's probably going to be the same for almost every Cal VTP in the future, because you're just checking all those boxes. They're already pre-mitigated. I think where the rubber hits the road is ARC, wildlife, and botany, or biology and ARC. And that work still needs to get done. But even then, just to throw an example out there for folks who are plant nerd oriented, but it's something like, if the rare plant that could possibly be at your site is a geophyte, has a tuber, then if you don't burn in spring, we've decided as a state, the Cal VTP has decided that the geophytes don't get harmed in fall burns. So if you're doing it in the fall, you don't even need to look for this thing, is the way I understand it. And I don't know if that's the case, and I'm curious what Mark has to say about that. And
as for one thing, CAL FIRE and the Board of Forestry needs to hear feedback, on how these are working for people. That's really important. So in terms of administering the program and the plan, it'll evolve for sure. But by the way, I've had some close connection to some large VTP projects in the Bay Area, San Mateo, Santa Cruz County, and I won't tell you what the costs are, but they're not, doesn't appear to be more streamlined or less than MND, but I think a lot of that has to do with the foresters just getting a comfort level and the agencies, and hopefully that'll change. But yeah, all the tools are there, and the idea is do your project specific analysis and just tear off that as much as possible. Yeah, there's no way around bio. ARC and bio ever on a big project. It's just the way it is. I'm comfortable. I've been comfortable with mitigated neg decks. Have a lot of BMPs. We don't call them mitigation measures, but also mitigation measures and mitigation monitoring plans, which are supposed to be disclosed at some point. You're monitoring, by the way, you're monitoring efforts and findings to the responsible agencies and the lead agencies. So yeah, it's hard to say which way is the best way to go, really. It all depends on the project. But as more things happen repeatedly on certain landscapes, I think the programmatic BTP EIR will have more advantages.
Yeah, I think,
Yeah.
I mean, that was my sense that people, as we keep moving forward, it's going to get, that was my main point that I didn't make very well, is that I think once you kind of figure out what's going on a little bit, and I think once agencies and we start working together on these things, more come out. I think there's only what, like 25 or 30 done. I don't know, not very many. So
yeah, not very many, and there needs to be more consulting firms who are exposed and gain experience.
Yes.
I mean, Ascent Environmental has done a lot of them, so they've kind of, they're way out ahead, and so they've kind of developed, and you can learn, look at those, the ones that have been done and approved, and everybody who's works on these tries to learn from how CAL FIRE treats and CDFW especially the process.
I have a specific question, and this might, people who are foresters working on forestry stuff might have an idea about how this works, but essentially that thing lasts 10 years as far as I know, ATP, at least 10 years. And if in my mitigations, pre-made mitigations, I say, oh, let's say we did a Cal VTP for 1,000 acres and it's going for 10 years and it's going to cover multiple projects. And I say, when we before we go into this unit and do some thinning, a botanist is going to come through and look for XYZ and flag it and avoid if we find. That happens year 5. Where does that documentation go to say that I did a botanical survey? Here's my memo, whatever it's asking for. I'm a little bit confused about how that works and where that would actually go to, because it doesn't seem like it goes to CAL FIRE. They told us just to give it to the lead agency, which is the Coastal Conservancy for us. So anyways, question.
Unless Mark knows more. I actually asked a similar question recently of CAL FIRE, because I have a program that I'm trying to do, and I was trying to see if this would work for it, where I didn't really know. Like, basically, I'm trying to recreate CFIP, so I don't know where my future projects are. And I was kind of hoping I could do a scoping for the whole county, and then when projects come up and I know where I need to do the survey, I could amend that. And that did not sound from CAL FIRE like that was going to work. I think you need to know where your project is, and I think you might need to have your surveys done.
Yeah, I mean, if it was an EIR or an MND, you would amend it. If you expanded your footprint, we've done that before. You amend your document and file that, for noticing again. It's an amendment, so it's not the whole thing done over.
So you
I'm
file
not
that?
sure.
Yeah. With who do you file that with? I guess is my question.
The county clerk and the clearinghouse. The amendment.
Okay, so this brings up another question. This is super helpful. Thank you. But aren't we, when you're doing a Cal VTP, aren't you giving that to CAL FIRE and they're responsible for? Jason, you're muted.
Yeah, no, just for posting it. So
Just for posting it.
You're kind of giving it to the Board of Forestry, and they post it on the Cal VTP website. That's
Okay.
the public noticing aspect of it, but it's the lead agency who is really in charge of making sure that that is in compliance with the already approved EIR. That's
Yeah.
my understanding.
Okay,
That's
so
correct.
they're
Right.
the lead agency is posting it to the clearinghouse. Yeah.
Now, a question that I have, and maybe Mark knows, would it be possible to do a mitigated negative declaration using justifications that were already identified in the programmatic EIR for VTP?
Yes, I mean, you could use a lot of the information in that. Yeah, you could, but
So maybe that would be, maybe that's something to think about for a longer term or a more flexible program is, maybe you go with an MND and you use the language and the thought process that's already gone through the state's EIR. You just kind of regurgitate that, but maybe that would provide more flexibility. What do you think about that?
Yeah, the trick there would be to write a very crisp and detailed project description. So
Okay.
you want to make sure your project description covers the whole range of your activities accurately. And that'd be important because you'd build in a lot of sideboards in there using VTP specific, protection measures, so that you could avoid having to do mitigation, possibly end up with an ND, for example. But yeah, I think the project description is super important, and it trips people up often. So you want to cover all what you're going to be doing on the landscape, and not do it in one paragraph. It might take pages, but it's a super important foundational part.
Also, if it wasn't clear to everybody, I don't know if it was super clear, but these things are posted. All these Cal VTPs are posted for public to look at, and it's super valuable. If you're writing one, just go look at someone else's and see what they did, and look at a few of them and try to understand if you have a question about a section. So I think just to really make sure people know they have access to that. So it's getting to be about an hour, a little over an hour and a half for this. Does anyone else have any quick questions, or or should we kind of wrap this thing up, let people get back to their evening here?
Actually, this is Kirk again, and I do have just one comment.
Mhm.
Former county planner and planning director. So I've been involved with CEQA for, well, not for 10 years, but I was pretty involved. One of the good methods that we found to use to get away from the detailed EIRs is to include BMPs as in your project description. If you include a lot of different BMPs, I'm going to avoid wetlands, or I'm going to avoid, whatever it is you're trying to avoid, but you include your erosion control, your smoke management, everything as a BMP in the project description itself. That can save you from a lot of trouble in environmental review. So that's just one comment.
Thanks.
Yeah,
Kirk.
that's a good one. That's what we're working on for the Shasta Valley RCD, and with Lyndsey.
That's an outstanding idea. Share it when you get it done.
Lyndsey Daly.
Yeah, one more quick question. Does anyone have experience doing CEQA on wetland and riparian burn units? And is that extremely difficult? We're just getting ready. We have a big project here on the shore, the lake shore here in Clear Lake, doing cultural burning in Thule. And there's kind of wetlands and then adjacent riparian areas. And we put a whole bunch of acreage in for our recent CAL FIRE proposal. And I'm just like holding my breath on the CEQA for that. How bad is that going to be?
I know CDFW has done quite a bit of burning in wetlands. I did some at the Arcata Marsh and Wildlife Sanctuary. We're just looking at a project in Siskiyou County that would be the same thing. And that possibly could fall under habitat enhancement, right? So you'd want to scope early with that trustee agency, CDFW, if it has a habitat restoration component to it, then you might make life a lot easier, and you could possibly use one of those exemptions. Although, there's the water quality aspect too. So I would just pre-consult on that to see what kind of headwinds you might have. But I've only done it in wastewater treatment, wetlands, cattails.
But Mark, would you recommend, like for Lyndsey in that particular thing, starting with the CDFW? Do you think that would be a good place to start?
Yeah, or even searching CEQA Net, because I know the state wildlife areas, there's been a lot of burning on jurisdictional wetlands done for on grazing lands that are also wildlife areas, state wildlife areas. I can try to track down some things to follow up. You just send me an email.
Great, thanks.
One thing I forgot to mention earlier, I just wanted to, just because it may fit somewhere with some people you're working with, but in any forest landscapes that are under a timber harvest plan or proposed timber harvest plan or a non-industrial timber management plan or a working forest management plan or a programmatic timber EIR, those are functionally equivalent documents, but a forester who's working on those can build in prescribed fire, oak woodland restoration, basically provide the CEQA coverage for doing fuel treatments that are maybe not commercial operations on some landscapes, or a ranch that has a combination of prairies, oaks, timberland. So that's another way to easily, easier than what we're talking about, probably cover some range of activities and have it approved as that. In that case, CAL FIRE is the lead agency, but we've talked to them, and that they would like to see more of that, especially in non-industrial timber management plans, but ownerships of 2,500 acres or less. But the working forest management plans are much larger, so there's a chance to work with landowners who have commercial timberland to build that in. Then that doesn't expire really, unless it's a THP. Timber harvest plan does.
It covers road construction as well. I think that's another important facet to this whole thing. So if there's long-term planning that you're thinking about, where you don't really have good access and you want to be able to get equipment into a certain area, you can at least permit it through there. And if you're working in commercial timberland, that provides funds to do things that you might otherwise not be able to find a grant to go and do. So I think that is an important consideration. Like, just like you're saying, you essentially would be using prescribed fire as your emergency / cleanup type work. So they're working on that at CAL FIRE. I'm trying to figure that out with Jackson. So that's some important stuff coming down the pipeline.
Any other wrap-up questions or thoughts before we all let this kind of sink in to our brains for the evening? Cool. Well, what do you think, Lyndsey? Should we shut it down?
Yeah, I was just going to remind people, that we have collected a lot of different CEQA resources and put them onto a Google Drive. And I'm not sure the best way to share that out. I mean, I know.
I think Delphine put up a link in the chat. Is that correct?
Yeah. And
oh, yeah. Okay.
I wonder if we could just get Lania to send that to everybody, or I'm not sure the best way to kind of keep that as a reference long-term, but
Right.
we'll try to figure that out, I guess. But yeah.
And it,
go
yeah,
ahead.
I would also encourage folks to, as we move forward in the next handful of years, if, something like this, or even just getting together and talking about issues is helpful to do once a year or twice a year, we should try to make that happen as a statewide PBA. Yeah, basically, if people want a project development CEQA therapy support group, just, yeah, maybe we'll send out that question if it was valuable, and see if it's worth doing this again in the future. And other than that, I think, thank you so much, all, Lyndsey, Mark, and Jason, and all you that brought all your knowledge as well. I learned a lot today myself, so.